There's a building in Washington, D.C. that shouldn't exist. The old post office pavilion completed in 1899. Granite columns, a 315-foot clock tower, vaulted ceilings with hand-carved stone detail. Cost $3.2 million. The federal government built it without collecting a single dollar of income tax from American citizens. In fact, the federal government built the entire transcontinental railroad system, funded the Spanish-American War, constructed the Library of Congress, and maintained a standing military across 45 states, all before 1913. That was the year the 16th Amendment was ratified, giving Congress the power to levy income tax on individuals. Before that, the official story is simple. Tariffs, excise taxes, and land sales covered everything, but the math doesn't match the buildings. Let me show you what I mean. In 1890, total federal revenue was approximately $403 million. The majority came from customs duties, roughly 57%, with internal excise taxes on alcohol and tobacco contributing another 30%. Land sales and miscellaneous fees made up the rest. That same decade, the federal government funded the completion of multiple transcontinental rail lines, began construction on the Panama Canal infrastructure, built 27 new federal courthouses, and expanded the Navy from 42 ships to 95. The USS Indiana, launched in 1893, cost $3 million. The pension building in Washington, completed in 1887, cost $886,000. The Montana State Capitol, finished in 1902, required $485,000 in federal appropriations. The 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago received $2.5 million in federal funding on top of private investment. Added up across one decade and the numbers stop cooperating with the textbook explanation. Consider the scope. Between 1865 and 1913, the federal government constructed infrastructure that rivaled anything built in Europe. State capitals with domes larger than the US Capitol, courthouses with marble imported from Italy, post offices in towns of 3,000 people that featured granite facades and bronze fixtures, custom houses in port cities designed like Roman temples. This wasn't frugality, this was abundance, and the people who kept the books remembered. There was a generation of Americans who worked inside the system before 1913. Clerks and accountants and treasury officials who saw how the money moved. Many lived long enough to be interviewed in the 1930s and 1940s by researchers trying to capture the last first-hand memories of the old economy. Their testimonies were filed in archives. Most were never widely published. Mary Dougherty was born in 1868 in Boston. She worked as a clerk in the U.S. Customs House from 1889 to 1922. In a 1938 interview preserved at the Massachusetts Historical Society, she described the ledger system used to track tariff revenue. When asked if tariffs alone could have funded federal operations, she paused, then said, "There were other columns. We called them special appropriations." The interviewer asked what that meant. She said the records were kept separately and she wasn't permitted to discuss them. John Hastings, a Treasury Department accountant from 1895 to 1931, gave a similar account in a 1941 oral history archived at the Library of Congress. He described reviewing federal expenditure reports in the early 1900s and noticing surpluses that didn't correspond to tariff collections. When he asked his supervisor, he was told those funds came from asset management and were not part of public appropriations. He never saw a full accounting. These weren't conspiracy theorists. They were clerks. They filed receipts, tracked expenditures, and balanced ledgers, and what they described doesn't match the official story we've been taught. The official story says tariffs covered everything. In 1880, tariff revenue was $186 million. In 1900, it was $233 million. In 1910, $333 million. Modest growth over 30 years. But during that same period, federal expenditures ballooned from $268 million in 1880 to $694 million in 1910. The gap widened every year. So where did the money come from? The textbooks say efficiency, economic growth, and careful management, but the buildings say something else. They say there was wealth flowing into federal coffers from sources that were either not publicly reported or were reported under categories that obscured their true origin. Wealth substantial enough to fund construction that still stands today, over a century later, as some of the most durable infrastructure in America. And in 1913, everything changed. The 16th Amendment passed. The federal income tax became law. And within a generation, the people who remembered how it worked before were gone. But the receipts aren't gone. The appropriations records, the customs ledgers, the Treasury reports from 1870 to 1912 are sitting in the National Archives. The testimonies from elderly clerks and accountants are preserved in university libraries and historical societies. The buildings themselves are still standing, physical proof that something funded them. The question isn't whether the government had money before 1913. Clearly it did. The question is where that money came from, and why the people who knew were never asked to explain it in detail before they died. Let me show you a specific case that makes the funding question impossible to ignore. The 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. 27 million visitors across 6 months. Over 200 buildings spread across 630 acres. The White City. Official records show the federal government appropriated $2.5 million for the exposition. The total cost of construction, however, was documented at approximately $28 million. Private investors in the city of Chicago covered most of that. But here's where the numbers fracture. The government building alone, a neoclassical structure covering 420,000 square feet, was funded entirely by federal appropriations. According to the official exposition directory published in 1893, construction cost $400,000. The building featured a central dome 120 feet in diameter, Corinthian columns carved from Indiana limestone, and interior halls finished with marble and gold leaf. It was completed in 18 months. For context, the Washington Monument, a simpler obelisk structure, took 36 years to complete and cost $1.2 million. The government building at the White City was exponentially more complex, built in half the time, for a third of the cost, and then demolished 6 months later. The construction contracts are in the archives. I found them because I was looking for something else, tracing appropriations records for the Bureau of Public Buildings. The primary contractor for the government building was George Fuller Company of Chicago. The contract, dated March 1891, specifies materials, labour schedules, and payment terms. What it doesn't specify is the funding source beyond federal appropriation. Treasury records from 1891 show total customs revenue for that year at $219 million. Total federal expenditures were $365 million, meaning the government was already running a deficit of $146 million. Yet somehow an additional $400,000 was allocated for a temporary exhibition building with no permanent federal purpose. That's one building. Across the same decade, similar appropriations appear for projects in multiple cities. The 1901 Pan American Exposition in Buffalo received $500,000 in federal funding. The 1904 Louisiana Purchase Exposition in St. Louis received $5 million. Each time, massive neoclassical structures built quickly, displayed briefly, then demolished completely. And each time, the funding appears in federal ledgers without clear sourcing. But here's the detail that researchers have struggled with since 1910. In that year, a congressional investigation led by Senator Nelson Aldrich examined